Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. The candidacy and almost certain election of 34-year-old Zohran Mamdani as New York City's mayor on Tuesday is sending shockwaves through the Jewish residents of the city that, aside from Israel, has the largest Jewish population in the world. And it doesn't stop there. In an unprecedented way, Mamdani's political rise has galvanized the attention not only of New Yorkers, of American Jews, but Jews around the world. French intellectual Bernard-Henri Lévy wrote this week that Mamdani's election would be no less than, quote, a beginning of rupture of the age-old pact between the world's most cosmopolitan city and the people of the book. It would be an earthquake in the history of Judaism. The reasons why the prospective first Muslim mayor of New York and the fears that his election is evoking have been expressed time and time again throughout the campaign by Jewish leaders in New York, even by liberals who share Mamdani's progressive views on many issues. Here's Central Synagogue's Rabbi Angela Buchdahl in her final Shabbat sermon before Election Day, capturing the mood of many that she's heard from in her congregation.
Mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani has contributed to a mainstreaming of some of the most abhorrent anti-Semitism. His shocking 2023 accusation, when the boot of the NYPD is on your neck, it's been laced by the IDF. This crosses the line clearly into anti-Semitism, not only demonizing Israelis, but echoing the age-old anti-Semitic trope that Jews across the world are the root cause of our problem here. His false claims of genocide, his reluctance to label Hamas a terrorist organization, his unwillingness to condemn phrases like globalize the Intifada and absolute opposition to Israel as a Jewish state contributes to an atmosphere of denigration and ostracization of Jewish people everywhere. In addition to dangerous rhetoric, his pledge to shut down the NYPD's Strategic Response Group, which broke up the violent protests at Columbia, could mean that when Jews are under attack, we may not feel protected. It is hard not to fear that the environment we witnessed for our Jewish children on Columbia's campus after October 7th could be a preview of the way that New York City could start feeling for all Jews. For so many in this community, this is reason enough to determine your vote unequivocally.
Buchdahl stopped just short of telling her congregants not to vote for Mamdani. Other rabbis, however, did so, and quite forcefully. Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, who leads the conservative movement's Park Avenue Synagogue, minced no words with a sermon that went viral, opening, quote, I believe Zohran Mamdani poses a danger to the security of New York's Jewish community. Coming on the podcast to talk about Mamdani and his impact on the Jewish community is Jacob Kornbluh, senior political correspondent for The Forward, who has followed every twist and turn of this race. I also speak with Dov Shenlin, who has written a column in Haaretz about his decision to vote for Mamdani, despite his disagreements with that candidate's views on Israel. Those conversations coming up. A special message for our listeners in the New York City area. Haaretz invites you to join us at the Other Israel Film Festival, taking place at the Marlene Meyerson JCC starting on November 6th. This year, Haaretz journalists will be hosting Q&A conversations with filmmakers, as well as taking part in a special panel on culture and freedom of the press in Israel. Haaretz readers and Haaretz podcast listeners get 20% off of all festival tickets. If you'd like to join us there, go to the Other Israel website and use code Haaretz25. That's Haaretz and the number 25. For more information, please check the festival's websites, which we will link in the show notes. We hope to see you there. Jacob Kornbluh, senior political reporter for The Forward. Welcome to the Haaretz Podcast.
It's always a welcome to be with you.
Jacob, the election is November 4th. Early voting has been happening since October 25th. Given the outsized lead that Mamdani has in the polls, is the Jewish community and our other New Yorkers basically preparing for having Mamdani as mayor, or are they still really fighting whether for his victory or to defeat him?
So, since Mamdani actually won the Democratic primary, it was presumed that he would go on to win the general election because this city is heavily Democratic and traditionally there's even no race for the general. The last time there was a race in the general was when Bloomberg ran in 2001 and in 1993 when Giuliani beat David Dinkins. And so New Yorkers usually vote in the primaries, and that's where they determine the winner. This year, after Mamdani won the primary, people were like scratching their heads and saying, hey, we weren't prepared for this because Cuomo was leading by a large margin. It was a double digit margin. Zohran Mamdani was not known to the public. I remember interviewing him in April, and he just came to the interview in a diner with one aide walking on the street. Nobody even looked at him, you know? And suddenly they sort of reckoning with, hey, we have a Democratic nominee who presumably the Democratic establishment will back, and Andrew Cuomo was just defeated. Eric Adams, the incumbent mayor, was an embattled mayor, very low popularity, and Curtis Lee nobody gave him a chance, and so they were reckoning with the idea that, oh, okay, like, how are we going to deal with this? So there was this period of people just, getting used to the idea, but trying to understand who that person is. Once Andrew Cuomo came back into the fold and gave that impression that there sort of can be a race in the general, because it's a very different electorate. You have to understand that, the Democratic primaries and a general election is a very different electorate. However, the energy that Mamdani brought, with the younger vote and with new voters, you had the opposite effect with Andrew Cuomo, because people were saying you were just defeated right now in the primary and you're asking for a second chance. Against whom? Against the Democratic nominee. He's also unpopular. Even the polls that show him closing the gap on a favorability rate, he's among the lowest. I believe that once Eric Adams quit the race and it sort of became a head-to-head matchup, the perception that Andrew Cuomo is the alternative to Zohran Mamdani gave people that idea that, hey, we can do something to stop Mamdani. And that's where you see all these rabbis giving these sermons and these open letters and the campaign against Mamdani, even though most of the rhetoric that he engaged in was years ago. And I believe that I even reported it during the primary. It's not something that he engaged in during the mayoral campaign. It's not something that he's repeated a lot. I mean, he obviously commented about Netanyahu, he obviously commented about Israel and the Gaza war, but people are just, becoming aware of his positions and the idea that you could potentially have a mayor of New York who will not march in the Israeli Day Parade, who will not travel to Israel, who will divest from Israel, who will close down the Tech Neon, or all these kinds of moves that the Jewish community is not used to. That sort of gives them a caution and worry.
Explain about the Technion and about Cornell. That Mamdani has said that he's going to end cooperation between the city of New York and Israeli universities, and these two programs are affiliated somehow with the city.
First of all, most of the positions that Mamdani has taken in support of BDS is not in his control. There is the New York City Comptroller, which is basically the chief fiscal officer of the city. And that person is actually very pro-Israel. Mark Levine, he's the Manhattan Borough president. He's Jewish. He even speaks Hebrew. He has said that he won't divest from Israel. So you have the mayor who has taken a very strong position in support of divesting from Israel, but he has said the same that he said when he pledged to arrest Netanyahu if he comes to New York, is that he will do everything according to the law. And if the law doesn't permit him to do that, he won't overwork his powers. I believe that's the case here. I'm just not very familiar with the technical ties when it comes to economic ties between Israel, the government of Israel, or Israeli companies and New York City. It's also worth mentioning that the current comptroller, Brad Lander, who is also Jewish and ran for mayor and supported Mamdani in the last stretch of the primary, he actually divested from Israeli bonds. However, he continued cooperation with Israeli businesses. And so there's this unique difference between investing or economic cooperation with the government of Israel, with the state of Israel, and with Israeli companies.
Jacob, talk to me about the mood that you're seeing as you cover this story among the Jewish community and their leaders as they, I mean, basically, if you look at the poll numbers, anticipate Mamdani becoming mayor, also as reflected in the polls of how Jewish voters are going to vote. But I'm also interested in your conversations with various populations in the city, the ultra-Orthodox population in Brooklyn, which I know you're very familiar with, and also sort of your typical Manhattan liberal New York Jews. What are they thinking and saying to you?
So you actually pointed to a very diverse Jewish community here in New York, and I would separate them into 5 groups, actually. First of all, you have these progressive Jews who will vote for Mamdani just because they agree with all of his positions and they are affiliated with the Democratic Socialists or with any other groups that are on the progressive lane. But then you have the liberal Zionists, right? Like people like Brad Lander, people like Congressman Jerry Nadler. They go on to support the Democratic nominee because, first, they don't want to face any Democratic challenges when they run for re-election, but also because that's the tradition, right? We are a party, we're a party of unity. And even though we disagree with some of the nominees' positions, we still get along. And that is sort of the changing mood of some of Jewish voters who say they disagree with Mamdani. They're a little worried about his positions, but since they hate Andrew Cuomo, since they are a Democrat, and since they want to participate in this election, they will hold their nose and vote for Mamdani. And then you have those who understand it's a challenge and they do want to cast a vote for Mamdani to show that they are not supporting him because of either his positions or they are concerned how he will be as mayor. And they're doing something that they haven't done before, which is not go with the winner just because of what he represents. The other part, which is more what some of the Haredi voting blocks have taken, is either we decide not to recommend anyone for mayor, which is also big because in previous elections they mostly went with a favorite because of to preserve their interests or to have a seat in city hall and engage with them in good faith. And so most of the voting blocks have actually stayed away and not issued any recommendations, even though they supported Andrew Cuomo in the primary. But they understand it's a challenge. They hope that the polls are wrong. They hope that they are mobilizing enough people or bringing also new registered voters to the polls so that they can actually make a difference. But they understand the challenge. And some of these groups, which including Isatma, which is ultra-Orthodox, however you call it, Hasidic or anti-Zionist, who have no problem with Mamdani's positions because, first of all, even though they won't protest against Israel, even though they are not outright against Israel in terms of the security of the people of Israel, they don't care much if he will divest from Israel or not much in the Israeli Day Parade. They just don't care about it. For them, it's more important to preserve their issues, which is one, Mamdani has pledged that he will protect them when it comes to yeshiva education. He said that his affordability and housing programs will benefit the community. And so what they are saying is he's anyways winning. We can't wage a war against him. Most of the things that are said about him are false. And so let's either support him or stay out of the race. And then you have the MAGA Haredi community, which is actually big, but in this election, they have a big challenge because Curtis Sliwa, who is the Republican nominee, he would get a majority of this vote if it wasn't a three-person race or if the Democratic nominee wasn't Zohran Mamdani, because they always go down the ballot. They always vote Republican. For them, voting for Republican is like a Torah commandment. But Curtis Lee was not the typical Republican. He's also engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric. He's a radio personality and has said some troubling things about the Hasidic community and about Jews. But they are still affixed at voting for the Republican nominee, no matter what. They don't have to win. They just have to have that MAGA hat and Republican label. And that is the split that you're seeing that ultimately I believe that Zohran Mamdani benefits from, because in a splintered Jewish vote, even though you can't necessarily determine the election, every vote that does not go for Andrew Cuomo ultimately, brings to his win.
Jacob, you not only cover New York City politics, you are generally a senior political reporter. Mamdani's presumed election will be a finger in the eye to the Democratic establishment. Do you think this is going to affect the national scene in terms of Jews and politics, especially Democratic politics, or do you think this is a very specific New York City phenomenon right now, or is it sort of the harbinger of a larger trend?
It has already had an impact in the 2024 election. The uncommitted movement, Kamala Harris, AOC, and others taking positions that are not of mainstream. But if you look at polls, they don't lie. Most polls show that even more than 70%, but a recent poll showed that among New York City Democrats, more than 70% believe that Israel engaged in genocide, that Israel is directly targeting Palestinians, starving that population, that you should arrest Netanyahu, that you should divest from Israel. And so what the positions that Mamdani is taking are out of mainstream and are fringe years ago, are now sort of mainstream in the Democratic Party. However, what you have is still an old guard, right? Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer. The leadership of the Democratic Party is sort of out of sync with the base right now. And they are not popular anymore. You potentially have these young, charismatic, impressive candidates showing up and winning elections from now on, because Mamdani has proven that if you run a good campaign, if you touch on the issues that most people care about, and if you just know how to, give a good speech and take the positions that most people agree with, you'll ultimately go on and win. And you also have to have a little luck to have a splintered field against you, and that the money that the billionaires are pouring in are not having an impact. But you're already seeing it in Minneapolis. You're already seeing it in Michigan in the Senate race. You will see it next year in the midterms, where even here in New York, obviously, you have Jerry Nadler, who is the co-chair of the Jewish caucus, right? And he is okay. He has supported the Iran deal. He was, more liberal and progressive in his positions on Israel, but he only recently came out in support of a bill that would halt certain arms sales to Israel. So even those who are still considered in the mainstream and are of the old guard are already shifting their positions because of the base.
Jacob, I'm not going to ask you who you're voting for, but you are, a visibly Jewish guy. Are you at all worried that Mamdani's election is somehow a green flag for anti-Semitism, that it's going to be more dangerous or harder to be a Jew in Mamdani, New York City?
It's hard to answer that because first, as a Jew, we are always worried, right? But I'm also a person who walks on the street, look Jewish, take the subway every day, walk in the streets of Manhattan and in other neighborhoods. And I'm talking about even post October 7, right? I again, like, this is not like suddenly the Mamdani's election is going to unleash a wave of protests and anti-Semitism, because we had that the past 2 years, okay, under a very pro-Israel mayor, Eric Adams, under a very pro-Israel governor, Kathy Hochul, and under a very pro-Israel president, Donald Trump. So the idea that the election of one person will just unleash that wave of hatred against Jews is really a fear campaign. Now, again, people are worried for the very reason that when you have a mayor who is a bully pulpit, right, who is very popular, who is a national figure, and has the media outreach that he has as mayor of the largest city in the US, engaging in rhetoric that is hostile to Israel, that is a problem. That could give voice to the fringe groups who are engaging and some, either displaying anti-Semitic slogans at their protests, or somebody who wants to have a reason to attack Jews. But again, this is a problem. The Democratic Party, this is a problem. The Republican Party, hatred for Jews was always in all centuries. But yeah, he's going to have a lot of work to do to, number one, convince the Jewish community that he's there to protect them. And once he's mayor, and it's not a campaign, he's not looking for votes, he's looking for govern. And he'll also be pretty much preoccupied with governing the city and pushing the legislation of his choice, not to deal with the nit and grit of what, the Jewish community cares about. It's important to note, and not many people are aware of that most of his senior staff in the campaign are Jewish. Now, they are young, they're not known to the public, but they're Jewish. He surrounded himself with a lot of people of great minds who are Jewish, and a lot of competent people who are Jewish. And so to suggest that if Mamdani wins, people will have to flee and it will become just intolerable for Jews, I think is just, overblown, in my opinion.
Jacob, I love hearing all your opinions and all your analysis. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and good luck on Election Day.
Always a pleasure. And make sure to be up on Tuesday night to watch the election results.
Coming up, I speak to a New York City voter who says he opposes many of Mamdani's positions on Israel, but that he's voting for him anyway. My conversation with Dov Shenlin is next. Dov Shenlin is program coordinator at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He is also a classical musician. And relevant to this conversation, he is a New York City resident and voter. Dov, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Allison. It's great to be here.
We've been discussing here what you went over in your column in Haaretz, and that's the fact that Zohran Mamdani's active pro-Palestinian advocacy has made many otherwise moderate to liberal Jews uncomfortable and worrying that his election could send what you call the wrong message to the world. You say that you oppose some of Mamdani's positions on Israel. What exactly do you oppose, and what makes you most uncomfortable about endorsing him in that department?
He has a position about Israel that is, I think, grounded in a respect for human rights and universal human rights and religious freedom, which is that Israel should not exist as a Jewish state. He has gone out of his way to say that he's against preferential treatment for any religious group. So he opposes the idea of Saudi Arabia as a Muslim state. But in my view, it's a little different because, Muslims there are hundreds of millions of Muslims in the world. There are maybe 30 or 40 Muslim countries. And, the Jewish state, I feel, is a historical necessity based on the centuries of persecution and the need for a homeland for Jews. And I think that runs into conflict with the sort of universality of human rights, but it's a necessity. And so it makes me slightly uncomfortable, but I appreciate that where he comes from is not from a place of anti-Semitism per se, not at all, I think. In fact, on a personal level, I feel he's demonstrated a tremendous commitment to the Jews of New York City. It's more of a sympathy with the Palestinians and a sense that the cause of Palestinian self-determination has been inhibited by the unfettered support for Israel that the United States has offered.
So you write that you have no qualms when it comes to voting for Mamdani. Why?
I don't think the mayor of New York City has any foreign policy portfolio at all. I think he may speak up on issues regarding Israel and Israeli conduct. I have a lot of problems with the way Israel has conducted itself in the last couple of years. Obviously, the attacks of October 7th were horrific, assault on Israel, on human rights in general, on the world. But I think that Israel's response has been problematic in some ways. I think he will speak out about those things, but I don't think he has any, New York City does not really have any particular foreign policy issues. The main issue we have in our time is the assault on our rights by President Trump and his government. And I think on those issues, Mamdani is a much safer bet than Andrew Cuomo. I think he will stand up for the rights of all New Yorkers to express themselves politically, however they see fit. And I don't believe Cuomo will do the same. I think Cuomo is vulnerable to pressure from the Trump government. He's openly seeking its support in this election. And so I feel that issue is kind of swamps all the other ones, particularly given that I don't think Mamdani will have any particular scope to conduct foreign policy on Israel. Now, I know that he has sponsored resolutions which have a anti-Israel cast to them, but I've looked into it, and the main one was one in the assembly that challenged the right of charities to support settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. And those settlements are illegal under international law. And I think that, to me, it's not as much of an assault on Israel's existence as on its conduct in the areas that violate international law.
You've called accusations by some of the Jewish opposition to Mamdani histrionic in your column. Do you feel like they've gone over the top in attacking him?
I do. It's very jarring to see Mamdani make the effort to go into synagogues and speak to people, and to see pro-Israeli protesters outside the synagogue protesting the synagogue's engagement with Mamdani. To me, that sends the absolute opposite signal, which is that, there are 1 million Muslims in New York City, which is roughly equal to the size of the Jewish community. And we've asked them to support pro-Israel candidates for decades. And, I feel that I don't want to impose a litmus test of support for Israel on a Muslim candidate, especially when it's not really relevant to the job that we're electing him for. And I think the Jewish community, his outreach to the Jewish community shows his sincerity in terms of fighting anti-Semitism. And he's spoken very much about the rise in anti-Semitism. He's acknowledged it, and he's determined to fight it. I think he's a candidate who sees everyone in New York as equal and deserving of the right to participate in public life. I think he's an inclusive, positive figure in that way. Cuomo, by contrast, I find very divisive. The way he speaks about communities, pits them against each other. He may be on our side now, but I think he's a creature of convenience, and like Trump, won't hesitate to throw us under the bus when it's time.
Well, you end your column very optimistically. The tanks are probably going to roll down Broadway no matter who wins. When they do, I know which side I want our mayor to be on. That's quite a statement. You really think the tanks are going to roll down, and you really think that Mamdani is your choice as the man that you think is going to stand up to Trump, and you don't trust Cuomo to do so?
Here's what I think. Trump, before the election, said all kinds of things. He said he was going to send in the army after our citizens. He said he was going to do mass deportations. He said he was going to tank all of our free trade agreements. And guess what? He's done all of that. And so I think it's worth taking him seriously in terms of the things he said. He's openly said that he wants to send the military into America's cities, which he portrays as some kind of crime-infested battlefield. Those of us who live in New York know it's one of the, it's hard for people to believe, but it really feels like one of the safest places in America. Crime rates have been falling, and, it's obvious pretext for asserting his political dominance in our city. I don't think that anything can stop him trying to do that. I think the election of Cuomo, some people say that Cuomo will be able to cooperate with Trump, moderate his worst impulses. I disagree. I think that It may begin that way, but the demands will keep increasing, and Cuomo will be at a point where he will have to either accept them or get out of the way. And I trust that Mamdani will do everything in his power to push back on those things. I think we shouldn't comply in advance with Trump's demands. And I think that a vote for Cuomo is basically more or less accepting those demands.
Dov Shenlin, your column is called I Oppose Mamdani's Stance on Israel. This is why I'm voting for him on Haaretz.com. Thanks for the column, Dov, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guests, Jacob Kornbluh and Dov Shenlin, and to producer and editor Nara Malkin. If you want to continue to listen to the podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a 5-star rating if you wish, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.